there are more people on Earth than investors, and we need to be thinking about what is the impact of the company on the rest of the environment or communities around or other stakeholders other than people who hold shares in the company.
Hello and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Green Software. I'm one of your hosts, Kate Goldenring, and today I'm joined by a very familiar face to the Environment Variables podcast at large and This Week in Green Software, Chris Adams.
Hey.
For this episode, we're going to dig into 4 stories, starting with how the SCI, or Software Carbon Intensity Standard, can support the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe, or CSRD. And then we'll dig into shifting into some research on how to do greener LLM prompting and energy management. And then we'll close by talking about a few other articles with regard to how to measure your kilowatt hours in your LLM inferencing sessions. And finally, with how AI is having an impact on the refurbishing market for laptops. So I want to go ahead and pass it off to Chris briefly to go ahead and introduce yourself for folks who might already not know you.
Thank you, Kate. My name is Chris Adams. I am the Director of Technology and Policy at the Green Web Foundation. Not the Green Software Foundation, the Green Web Foundation. We're a smaller, wackier Dutch non-profit focused on a fossil-free internet. But as members of the Green Software Foundation, we're involved in a number of the projects. So I'm leading the software carbon intensity for web development of a standard, and that's just the call I jumped from this onto here. And I'm also the chair of the policy working group, and you can see some of the output that we create on the links that we added to the show notes. But if you Google or Bing or Kaggy or whatever search you want to use, look for Green Software Foundation Policy Working Group, and you'll see some of the output that we have there. Kate, it's quite nice being on the other side, so thank you very much for being the host, so I can basically be guided through the stories this time.
I'm happy to be filling this role. Thank you for getting me here. And just a reminder that before we get started, that everything that we talk about in the show will be linked. So if there's anything you want to dig deeper into, hopefully you can find it in the show notes. And Chris, you mentioned that you've worked on SCI for web and that you're a part of the policy working group. And our first topic really digs into these expertise areas that you have. And that is that the Green Software Foundation put out a white paper that discusses how the SCI standard can be used to help companies meet the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, that's rolling out now. And I would love to pass it off to you to talk a little bit about CSRD and how SCI can help companies meet the goals of it and meet their audits. Especially for me, kind of digging into all of it, there was a lot to understand, and I think it's a very interesting subject.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. So for people, if you haven't heard of CSRD, that's okay. It's not necessarily your job, but if you're working in a company above a certain size, there are basically various laws all around Europe that basically mean these companies do need to report this every year, as starting from basically this year. And like we are now seeing, we've had the first kind of like set of these reports by companies in Europe above a certain size who basically have to go beyond just having a kind of sustainability report, but instead have a much more structured sustainability report following a bunch of standards. So rather than just having nice kind of pretty pictures of, say, I don't know, smiling people outside factories and stuff like that, you need to share information like things like, say, what were your organizational carbon footprint? How much of that came from, say, electricity? How much was in your supply chain? Other questions might be, how much revenue did you get from the oil and gas sector? Stuff like that. There's all these really interesting data points. And the reason this law came about was part of actually a plan early in the 2020s in Europe to basically have a set of laws to kind of steer the entire European Union to something close to carbon neutrality in the 2030s, basically. So that was the kind of idea that they have. And this was one of the big kind of laws for the first time to kind of introduce mandatory reporting against all these different specific data points in a way that is consistent and comparable and ideally machine readable. And for the first time ever, things like cloud emissions and data center kind of emissions were literally written into the standard that this law actually uses. There's a standard called the fun-named European Sustainability Reporting Standards. That's what they have inside this. And this paper that is linked basically says, here's how this standard can be used to help report against some of this stuff. And one of the reasons you have this is that because it's the first time, there's lots and lots of people in lots and lots of companies who don't really know how to report, say, the emissions from cloud computing or software, because it's not something you've done for the first time. And to be honest, for the first year or two, there was this kind of implicit kind of understanding from lawmakers saying, yes, we understand that most people won't quite know how to do it. So while there are these honestly quite significant sticks associated with the CSRD, like if you don't report, then there's like a percentage of your turnover available and ever fine. So that's like significant amounts. And in certain parts of Europe, there are even things saying like if you're a director of a company and you are and you either do not you do not disclose following this law, or you basically try to interfere with the process, you can literally go to jail. So like this is the first time you've actually got serious teeth behind sustainability reporting. And as a result, there's been lots of people running around thinking, oh, how do we do this properly now? Because I don't necessarily want to go to jail, for example, because you actually have this kind of liability that we've never seen before. And inside this kind of standards, this ESRS, there's a specific thing talking about carbon emissions for like things you should and shouldn't include inside this. And this is where this idea for software carbon intensity will come into it as one way that you might actually start measuring the impact of a given service so that you've got a consistent way to kind of compare maybe one system versus another one, for example, or so that you've actually got at least a methodology or approach that you could justify when speaking to the auditor who has to sign off on this. Because this is one other thing that's different from some other reports in that you actually have to have a auditor sign off on these reports. So this is the first time you've actually had a notion of information that's transparent, the information that's structured, comparable, and also to a degree kind of trustworthy. That was the idea behind this, I suppose. And this piece here talks a little bit about saying, okay, here's a way to think about this. And now that I've provided some of that context, maybe, Kate, there's maybe a few questions that you might have, because this is a big thing, and it was quite a kind of seismic shift in sustainability reporting departments, because they're like, oh, I need to get these numbers together, but I've never really had a conversation with IT. And some people say, oh, it must be really simple, but I'm pretty sure, Kate, you could share that maybe it's not that simple after all.
Yeah, off the bat, I'm very excited about it because it really shifts green software from being best practice to being a requirement and an audit topic. And I'm curious, is part of the ESRS, isn't part of it that you have to have reduction targets as well? So you have to say how much you're going to reduce your emissions over time by?
So this was actually, this is one of the things about having to get involved in, like when you start looking at some of this, you realize just how much like this thicket of laws and how they interact with each other. So there is one law, which is the reporting directive. That was part of this package that I mentioned at the beginning of the 2020s. However, there was a second law called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which was another law which basically says, you can think about it in terms of there was one law called the CSDDD. This was saying you need to have a climate transition plan to demonstrate that you're actually aligned with the kind of national or like supranational ideas of reducing emissions by half by 2030, for example. And you could think of the CSRD as you demonstrating your progress every single year to show that you are doing this. So it may be that in your transition plan, you might actually say, well, we know we have a digital estate and we have all these apps and we do all these things, but we want to set performance standards that improve by, say, 10% year on year, for example. That might be one thing you actually do. And it might be that each year you use something like the CSRD to record progress as you go through this. So maybe you say we're going to halve all of this, and that's how we're going to track it, in the same way that if you had a transition plan for cars, you might say we want to improve the fuel efficiency of our cars by 20% per year between now and 2030. That's kind of in the mental model that you can actually apply for some of this, really. And that's how they interact with each other. And like that took me a while to get my head around. And the only reason I know about this is that in 2024, we spent a bunch of time trying to see if there was a there, or if there was something we could use from these laws ourselves.
I think, and you just explaining how much time it took you to wrap your head around, I'm sure all these companies are trying to wrap their head around it. And like you mentioned, there's plenty of sticks motivating that. But the fact that there are rates that you're trying to achieve is why reduction rates is why SCI is actually a really good pairing for as a tool for companies. And that's what the Green Software Foundation's white paper really drives home, is because SCI is the carbon intensity of a functional unit. Even if your company's business scales, so your software scales, now you're running across like 20 virtual machine instances instead of 10 because you're serving 30 or 40 times more users, you've shown that you can serve, say your functional unit is a transaction per user, you're serving way more people while also reducing your targets. And I thought in the white paper is really interesting. They walked through an exact example of a fake company they came up with called Payment Co., where basically Payment Co. defined the software carbon intensity of a transaction of their application, and they calculated the kilowatt hours of that transaction. And then they did a deeper dive. They tried to find out which parts of their service were using more energy, and they found that their database was using 25% of all of the energy, which was a lot more than a standard database should be using percentage-wise of their whole application. So they basically use standard database optimizations by doing query optimization and caching, which led to a 7% improvement in the overall SCI of that unit, and reduced their AWS costs by 8.5K annually. And this was an example that they contrived to illustrate how SCI not only helps engineers drill down into how to make their software more sustainable, but it also helps a company save money, because when you save energy, you oftentimes save money. And they're able to put this in their report to show that they're hitting their reduction targets. And so it's a really empowering white paper, because it shows how we have a measurement tool for software measuring the carbon intensity of it, and how you can directly use it to meet multiple goals, whether that's a budget goal or an auditing goal. And I thought it was very well done, and a really nice illustration.
Yeah, like this is actually this is one of the things that I guess is a bit double-edged, right? Software carbon intensity as a standard is very, very flexible. So it does allow you to say, well, what's the carbon footprint of me, say, helping someone complete a sale? Or what's the footprint of someone loading a web page? There's all these different, or what's the carbon footprint of, say, helping someone book a cab ride, right? That's your functional unit. That's the kind of thing that you want to have a kind of useful, quantified discussion about how you might improve that, right? Because let's say you were to say, well, we've got 5 years and we need to halve emissions, right? It's having something to target on a monthly basis, or to track, having a kind of metric should help you get there, basically. There is an open question then. It's like, well, okay, how much do I need to reduce it by year on year to actually get to that point? And like, that's a whole kind of separate discussion, because you do need to be able to like think about how that will compound between now and say, oh, blimey, it's nearly halfway through 2026. So I can't even say 5 years ago, you're 3.5 years left. But that is one of the mechanisms that you have. And this is not a million miles away from, improving miles per gallon or improving the energy needed to do anything else inside a given business. It's just that you have a kind of structured, defensible way to have a conversation with an auditor to say, yeah, this is what we're trying to optimize for, or here's what you manage, the same way you might manage lots of other things. And theoretically, this should be something that you can have a conversation with people who are not domain experts, who is maybe a manager of this, and say, we're going to try and improve this by 20% each year, for example, or something along those lines.
Yeah, and I'm curious, you mentioned an example of a unit, so maybe checking out. how many different SEI formulas is a company going to need to have to encompass their entire spread, software spread? And how are people going to break that down from team to team and establish ownership? That to me seems to be the really tricky part of this.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, I mean, I'm kind of glad that I came from the SCI web call just to come onto this one, because you can think of the new standard, this SCI web thing, as being a much more focused, like, response to the fact that having a very open-ended and flexible standard can be a bit difficult, right? So the thing that we've done with SCI web, we did an entire kind of three-month process to say what are the activities that we think are actually going to have a measurable impact on reducing the environmental footprint of any kind of digital service that you're making available to people, right? And then we've said, like, which things are kind of common enough so you could kind of like fix some of these things. So if you're looking at, say, SCI for the web, where you're looking where the primary thing people are doing is visiting websites, then there's maybe some things you might have which are tied specifically to, okay, can I set a kind of a target on the resource consumption when I'm like viewing and rendering a web page, for example, as opposed to doing something totally separate, right? That's the idea behind having maybe an SCI specifically for something like, say, a website, for example. And one of the key things we have, and we can add a link to this in the show notes, is that we've laid out who are the people who might be tracking, who need to be involved, and what some of these functional units might actually be, because the term functional unit is actually a bit of kind of sustainability jargon, and most people wouldn't know a functional unit if they dropped it on their foot, right? So you need to at least provide some guidance on what that really might look like. And the thing that we've ended up with for some of the web stuff at the moment is, say, page views, but also specific user journeys that you're able to kind of you're able to kind of drive in the same way that you might do an end-to-end integration test. This is something which is a useful proxy, and it may be that inside an organization you might have different people with different SCI targets, but this is more like a kind of management tool to help you have something that you can target that you can do in the kind of time frame that, I say, a software's like a sprint might be taking place, for example, or something like that. The idea being that I know that I'm going to be doing, say, this many transactions. I know the carbon footprint of each transaction is going to be this much. At the end of the year, I could get a rough idea of what the total impact of that might actually be. But that gives me something I'm able to use to kind of track that. And across an entire enterprise, it may be different people with various functional units that they're trying to track. But ultimately, these all can be. You could basically end up with a total carbon figure for each of these things. That's the thing that's like the general idea behind this, really.
Yeah, I like how so many different things you said there. One, you emphasize being able to hone in on what's measurable and being able to start people at least where they can measure. Number two, mentioning how like these refined SEI equations can really help people in their domains. I know there's SEI for AI as well. And then also comparing the ability to measure it to an integration test suite. And this kind of also gets into the part of telemetry being so important and being able to use your telemetry to not only check on how you're doing, but also figure out how to aggregate your final total. So it's really going to be in conjunction with infrastructure and operations engineers to kind of get these final totals.
Yeah, precisely. So this is the idea of, like, I mean, some of this is kind of new language for people who aren't used to, who haven't had to like think about sustainability every day. But when you think about in terms of an integration test, or the fact that there's a particular function or a thing I'm trying to do, you can start to kind of see things through a kind of like sustainability or resource impact lens. It is a little bit weird to get used to, but but I think there are quite a number of similar concepts that you can apply to help you look at this stuff. And there now are a growing number of tools which are actually in the public domain that you can use that will give you examples of this. So, for example, there's one tool run by our German friends at Green Coding Solutions. They have a thing called Green Metrics tool, and that gives you software carbon intensity figures for various kinds of software. And there's various open source projects where they've actually run this, so you can see some examples of like what a functional unit might be, and then what the numbers, what the kind of carbon per page load or per cron job might be, for example. But there's other tools, like there's one called Cardamon, which we'll share a link to. That is probably the easiest way I've seen people use for, if you're doing stuff for the web and you just want to get an idea of what an SCI score for a page might be, that's one example as well. There's a couple of other ones, and I think, Kate, I think you actually spoke about one of these before, like WebNRG. That was one tool that also showed this. So we've gone from this being a kind of abstract but neat idea to some things where there's actual implementations that you can actually start working with. And some of them are commercial and some of them are open source. So the field is starting to mature, but there's two of us speaking on a Green Software podcast here. And like we've got some views, but we're still kind of niche. You know, this is not, this isn't mainstream yet, but hopefully with laws like the CSRD and stuff like that, that at least create some drivers for people to be more aware of this and to have a reason to like develop some of these new muscles. Because I think most people who are listening to a podcast like this, they would like they would like to build software that moves us away from planetary destruction rather than towards planetary destruction, I suppose. And that's it. I'll end there, I suppose.
No, I think it's very powerful. I mean, I think about how the EPA basically made environmental consulting an industry. I think this potentially makes green software an industry. And I think that's very exciting. And so this white paper was published March 31st. So very interesting if you want to look at kind of how SCI relates to CSRD. And I guess I have one other question, Chris, because and this is the main topic for us today, but I was wondering if you could help me understand the point in CSRD about double materiality. Because this was the hardest for me to wrap my head around. I think it might be for others. About how you report from both an outside-in perspective and an inside-out perspective, and that just got me all turned inside out.
All right, so what I've done, I've shared an actual, so I said like we were looking at this in 2024 at the Green Web Foundation. We were scratching our heads, and because this stuff wasn't particularly easy to kind of get your head around straight away, one of the things we ended up doing was creating these little video briefings of like, what does double materiality mean? What is XBRL? Or what is CSRD? And I've shared a link to one of the videos we've made public, as well as a deck that we have. The simple way to think about what materiality and double materiality is and why you would care about this is the CSRD and other tools like this, they were initially designed for investors to be able to make more, we can call them responsible, but you might also call them long-term greedy decisions rather than short-term greedy decisions. Like if I want the share price of a publicly traded company to kind of continue to rise in the long term, it would be good if they were at least somewhat insured from all the various kinds of physical and climate risks that we see happening all around us. Things like crops, like crop damage and stuff like that. So, but this is like one of the traditional kind of the traditional like ESG responsible investor kind of view, which is basically saying, well, how do I make sure that my investment is protected from the climate, right? So that's not really about like what is my company doing, it's like who's protecting my money and my company from the environment, from climate change, right? The double materiality is something which was introduced with CSRD, which basically says, actually, no, I don't think that's the only way we should be thinking about this, because there are more people on Earth than investors. And we need to be thinking about what is the impact of the company on the rest of the environment or communities around it or other stakeholders other than people who hold shares in the company. This is the idea of double materiality, that it kind of goes both ways, because for the longest time, the entire discussion around corporate sustainability was basically talking about not really an impact. It's only talking about dangers one way rather than the company's impact on anyone else who might be locally nearby or anything like that. Like if you were to say, well, I need to care about people, the idea was like, I need to care about people because otherwise they won't buy our stuff. That's like the kind of one way. Whereas the double materiality approach might be saying, I need to care about people because I know society is a stakeholder and we should be caring about this stuff anyway, basically. That's the kind of difference. And that was one of the things which got a serious amount of pushback in when people were initially talking about this. And that's why I shared the links, because it took a while for me to get my head around, because for most of us, we might think about double materiality, or we might even come to sustainability thinking that of course you're going to think about double materiality. Of course you're going to think about the impacts of my entity on everyone else. But no, when viewed through a financial lens, you're only really talking about how does this protect my share price? And that is that's the kind of paradigm shift that was introduced here, that you've had bunches of people fighting over now. And that's like, I guess that's the reality of the world we're in, I suppose. And we'll hopefully we'll see this become more popular, because I think although it's complicated, because like whenever you look at anything related to sustainability, there's always other different things to track. The idea of actually us having a two-way interaction with like the environment or of a company, it feels like intuitively much more sensible and much more natural to the way I think about the entities that impact my life, I suppose. So yeah, that's the kind of short version, and we've got a video if people want to watch that, which should be about, I think, 5 minutes long, if you want to kind of dive a bit deeper into that.
That was an amazing summary. I don't even think I need the video, but I'm glad it's a resource we can share, especially sharing the financial perspective of how that came to be. So thank you. I feel like I have that aligned in my head now. And are there any other resources that people should be aware of for hitting CSRD reporting compliance and in general around this area?
Yeah, I told you that the thing that was interesting about this report is that it's actually structured information, right? So the idea was that there's a schema to this stuff. And back in like late 2024, we landed a bit of funding where I work at the Green Web Foundation for a project that we call carbon.txt. The idea was that for any domain, you would be able to find, we knew that all this data was going to be released in structured format, but because the law basically says you need to publish this stuff for the public to see, but it doesn't say where this information should be. So the thing we basically came up with was a project to tell people where to look for this. So the idea was you could go to any domain /carbon.txt, and then if there was like a CSRD report or anything, the idea would be that you would link to where that thing would be. Because we figured if this stuff is structured and machine readable and comparable, then you're going to want to parse it and do things with it. So we actually built an entire piece of software, a validator that basically reads these reports, and it can like reach into a report and pull out some of these data points. So if there's a company that has, say, here's our emissions for, say, data center stuff, for example, the idea was that you would have something like that. That was the idea. So we built that, and that's an open source project. If you go to carbontext.org, you'll find some of the information out there. And we designed this so that you could extend this to look for other figures, because the thing that was cool about the CSRD thing was that there were all these data points. We cared about climate change, but there's stuff about water, about labor rights, all these things here. So the idea was that if we build the tool that allows us to look for the information that we care about, anyone else who wants to pull other information from these structured reports can do it for all the other things they care about. So if you care about, say, modern slavery, if you care about labor rights, you should be able to do like a single query for these structured reports. That was the idea. I'll share a link to it because I think it might be interesting to some of the nerds on the call, basically.
I'd love to look at it. And so it would scrape that information from the carbon.txt that the host
that's
of
like
the website would own.
Yeah, a little bit like, how sitemaps.xml points you to where the pages are, or if you have like llms.txt, it points you to where the information is to kind of read. The idea was we would say, well, there's going to be this motherload of information that companies are forced to publish. And if you can point to it, and if it's going to be structured, then you should be able to use that and do interesting stuff with that. Because under the hood, these reports, sorry, this is a bit nerdy now. The reports are published in a particular format called, ESEF, like the European Single File or something like that. And under the hood, that's just XHTML, like HTML. So you can query that. So we found a piece of software called ARail, which was designed for the financial sector to actually parse these kinds of files. And we figured, well, okay, do they support these new standards? Yes, they do. Can we use that to pull the information out? So we did it to basically, if there's a given report, we built the tool so that you could reach into the report and pull out the like scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, what percentage of their power came from renewable sources. We did that because we have a thing where we check if a website runs on green energy, and this was actually one way where there'd be some structured information for this. But yeah, we should add a link to that to the show notes because it'd probably be interesting to some people.
I'm sure it will be. I'm already excited to set aside some time to look at that. So thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
With that, I think we're ready to move on to our next topic, which is another exciting one. This is a research paper that basically shows that when you are prompting an LLM, it's not about the length of your prompt that causes a resultant increase in the cost of the output. Rather, there's actually specific keywords that can measurably shift the amount of energy an inference does. And if that holds up broadly, it changes the advice that we give people on how to more sustainably prompt. It's not just write shorter prompts, but it's write prompts that avoid expensive behaviors unless you truly need them. So this paper is titled Green Prompting, Characterizing Prompt-Driven Energy Costs of LLM Inferencing. And it came out of the School of Computing and Communications in Lancaster, University, UK. And to drill into kind of the method of the research, what it did is it looked at 3 models and 3 tasks that you could have a model do. So question answering, sentiment analysis, and text generation. And for each of those tasks in each of those models, it measured the amount of latency, energy consumption, and length of output. And what it found was that some of these keywords that we'll talk about led to higher or lower energy consumption, which was highly correlated with the length of the result. So as you'd imagine, text generation prompts were the most energy intensive because they had the longest responses. And so some of the high energy words to avoid, they varied across what type of prompt you did. But in general, explain was very expensive because you're asking a model to output more information, while the word that really cut down on the result were things that asked the model to be more precise. So the word classify was one of the lowest energy intensive words. So one takeaway you could have is when you're prompting a model to basically avoid the word explain and try to ask for a precise response, unless, of course, you need more verbosity.
I'm glad you shared this because this gives a really good idea of how unintuitive text interfaces can actually be for most of us, right? There's this idea that something like a ChatGPT style interface is super easy to use because you just type things in. But it's not at all obvious that some of these tools have these other impacts inside this. I mean, on one level, intuitively, when you say, like, let's say there's this topic now, corporate sustainability report directive, right? If you say, like, define what CSRD means, right? That's like one thing. Or like, on another one might be, walk me through the implications of CSRD. Like these 2 prompts, they're about the same length, but one of these is going to have much more output coming from this. And I think that's maybe one of the takeaways that you can actually have is that there are ways that you can actually like think, there are kind of maybe unintended consequences of some of the words you're using when you're doing something like this, because there's certain things which are like keywords which trigger certain kinds of behavior that you might not have initially been thinking about, I suppose. And like, I guess like there's a way that you can flip this around. Like there are kind of system prompts and things where you can say, please, I prefer terse response, or please do not be quite so sycophantic with me and stuff like that. Like this is actually what I've ended up putting into some tools that I use when I'm using something like a LLM style interface. I've added something to just say, please keep some of this a bit shorter. But there's also a bit of guidance for people who might want to take some of this away as a immediately useful thing. There are, say, good examples. I think Green PT actually have a guide on like how to do kind of this kind of like more sustainable prompting for this. So you become a bit aware of what words will trigger masses and masses of text to be vomited out, which ones won't, for example. And there's some other things you can do. There's a few other hints like that, but like I said before, this speaks to how a lot of the time these are actually quite unintuitive interfaces because you're not quite sure what's necessarily going to happen. And that's before you take into account the fact that these are all stochastic and they're non-deterministic. So sometimes they'll give you some a certain kind of output, and then the second time round, it might give somewhat different output because it's not a deterministic program like most of us have grown up working with, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because some of these models also you can set the verbosity level for your agent sessions, and it'd be really interesting in tandem with our next topic to kind of do this experimentation ourselves. I would love to talk about open code and the integration that you worked on in conjunction with Joey Tomets, or Tomez, depending on the pronunciation, at NeuralWatt, to basically make it so that you could basically see the kilowatt hours of energy used for your agent session, because that's a really cool basically transition where maybe in my own agent coding sessions, I can try this out. I can stop using the word explain and use more classify and see actually how the kilowatt hours change just in the UI that I'm directly interacting with.
Do you know what? I never actually thought about that, Kate, but that's actually a really good idea. I was initially thinking, I've only seen this kind of idea of like, be better at prompting in tools like GreenPT, because that's like the only tool I've seen out there that really exposes an interface for this right now. But yeah, you're right. Actually, you probably could use it in something like that. That was like an unexpected use case that came out of this. The link that Kate's referring to is a post I've shared on LinkedIn, which contained like a video that Joey shared with me, actually. We've back and forth. We've been talking about there's a service that Joey and someone else we interviewed on this podcast called Scott Chamberlain, they were working on a LLM service, an inference service called NeuralWatt. And NeuralWatt was one of the other rare breed of services that actually shares energy consumption information with every single API request. And the thing that I was chatting to the folks at NeuralWatt about was we were saying, well, this is cool. And we extended independently. We'd both built like separate plugins for this tool called LLM, which is by Simon Willison. It's a Python command line tool that lets you type in LLM and then a bit of text, and it would just vomit a bunch of stuff out. And I used that to kind of play around and understand how the NeuralWatt API worked, but also how to surface energy consumption figures. And then that was cool, but that's maybe one use that I was making of code maybe like a year and a half ago. But this was way before like agentic coding became a thing, or if you prefer vibe coding, where you're not really doing one prompt, you're doing lots and lots and lots of prompts, right? And I was trying to figure out how you might surface this, and that got me kind of kicking the tires of open code, because it seemed like one project that was out there was open source. There's maybe one or two obvious places, and once I figured out how to do it with LLM, I figured, maybe we could put it in here, for example. And I won't lie, I used a agentic coding tool to say, check out this repo, please help me, and then please check out this other repo that I've created. This is the approach I'm taking with the LLM project. I would really like to do this with open code, because I think open code is an interesting project, but I don't know where to start. Can you help me understand where we might make an integration for this? So we did that, and then basically Joey and myself were sharing emails back and forth, where I would basically create a gist of the research and say, here's where you might have this. And then I basically nerd sniped him really, really hard. He basically sent back an email with a GIF saying, hey, Chris, check this out. And I was like, wow, someone else has built this because I can't build it, or I didn't know how to build it at the time. And he had this running. And then that was actually something we had at like the beginning of March, I think. But I realized that it wasn't visible to anyone. So I basically tried to figure out how to use a video, a screencasting thing, to basically record this and like point to the bit that was actually important, because as software developers, we're not necessarily that good at making screencasts or making the thing that we care about really visible. So I did that and then wrote this post and saying, hey, it's something that you should have visibility on. And we basically ended up with Joey created a fork of the open code project that had this as a kind of proof of concept, and we shared that around. And I think that's still one of the few tools I've seen which makes things like agentic coding, the actual energy consumption, visible. But there's no reason that you couldn't have that in any other tools. And now that like Claude Code, for better or worse, has been leaked, you could probably point to how that should be something you should have used. And if you're a paid customer for something like that, then maybe that's one where you could say, hey, can you please expose these numbers as well? Because we know it's possible. And if you're a responsible engineer, it does feel like it's kind of on us as professionals to at least care about this or know about some of this, I suppose. So yeah, that was how some of that came together.
And the video you shared, your short video of what you all did, was eye-catching, because basically what it shows is from your experience as a developer or anyone working with an agent, you may be used to seeing tokens, and then it adds under the context another line there that says megawatt hours, and so you can see it's not just how many tokens you've used, but you actually see the amount of emissions that have occurred, because tokens isn't always a helpful measurement because you don't know where the energy is coming from for the specific model you're using. So I also cloned the pork and tried to build it locally and didn't quite get to the point of attaching it to a model where we could get the kilowatt hours out of it, but it was very quick, and I'm excited to use it in my everyday setup as well.
Well, this is one thing I actually learned when we were playing around with it. I realized that, I realized just how little I know about making this work with specific LLMs, for example, and what kind of comes out of it. Do you know what? Speaking to you has actually made me realize that I probably should either work on this myself or possibly nerd snipe someone else who's listening to this, because we have a library where I work at the Green Web Foundation called CO2JS, which now actually has basically emission factors, conversion factors for every single grid in the world, courtesy of a deal we did with Electricity Maps. So you can download CO2JS, and then you can figure out, like, for this amount of energy consumption, you can get this carbon from it. And this is something I was going to try and build. But maybe if I talk about this and share a link in the show notes, someone might build it before I do, and then they get the bragging rights, and we talk about their thing on a future episode. Because I think that one of the nice things is, like, if you show where some of this is, it becomes something that people can actually work with. And I think this is actually that was the next step that we were hoping to do. But in order for you to do that, you need to get an idea of where the inference is being served from. And that is something that isn't really exposed that much at the moment. But in some conversations with the folks at NeuralWatt, they said, yeah, we're happy to share some of those numbers to show, share where in the world they're coming from. Because I think from memory, there's one place which is serving it in Scandinavia. I think it's Finland or possibly Norway, which has very, very low carbon intensity. And there's another place in a US state that's served by Duke Energy. And that doesn't really narrow it down, but there's a few of them around, and that may be one of the things. And maybe that's the next step we go, because that could actually have, like, literal carbon figures in the stuff you're doing. So you could get an idea. Okay, well, when I do this, here's what the carbon footprint of this might be. Or when I say something else, here's what the carbon footprint of that might be.
So is NeuralWatt hosting the models, and that's how it is generating the numbers? Okay, cool. So my brain hadn't mapped to that yet. I was thinking maybe they were making estimates based on the what you plugged in. So say I had
this is
like
what's so exciting about it.
Subscription. Yeah.
So this is the thing that's really, really cool, is that NeuralWatt are one of the only providers I know that basically charge for AI inference by the kilowatt hour. And that, in my view, is really interesting, because if we talk about computing being this kind of utility that we need to rely on, the same way that we rely on electricity or water or things like that, then I think you do need to expose some of the numbers. Because one of the switches when you move from, say, an ICE car to an EV is that the unit you have is now kilowatt hours per mile or something like that. And you don't really talk about it in terms of, like, that's the thing you're tracking, because it's easy to convert kilowatt hours of energy into carbon, because we have a good idea of how they're generated. When you have an intermediate thing like, say, tokens or something like that, it becomes harder. And it's a bit like if you tried to work out the carbon footprint of driving only by looking at, say, RPM on your tachometer, on your rev counter, like, yeah, there's going to be like a correlation, but that's not really the thing that you're burning that emits the carbon, right? So why not just go straight to the actual unit? And for the most part, it's largely because companies don't necessarily want to share that with you. But thankfully, there are companies like Neural which do share this with you. And I think it'd be good to see more organizations doing something like that, because it becomes much easier for us as engineers to actually make more informed decisions, because we know what's going to be happening, rather than having to go through, like, take a kind of like reroute through an indirect, abstract kind of thing that we're tracking instead, basically.
100%. Now I'm even more motivated to get this set up working locally for me. So it might get me to stop having a personal subscription with Claude and switch to NeuralWatt. So I'm loving this.
Okay, cool. All right, should we look at the last story then?
Yes, let's head to the last one. So The last one is a YouTube video that's gotten a lot of views. I think around over 1.5 million by Salem Techsperts, which is a laptop refurbishing company that is also a big streaming entity talking about their experience in refurbishing laptops. And the name of the video is "I Can't Sell You Laptops Anymore." And it's a firsthand account of how AI-driven demand is pushing up RAM and storage prices, and it's squeezing the refurbished laptop market. So it's basically making it so that they can't get used laptops that come with RAM and storage, because the RAM itself is worth more than the old laptop. So companies will be just buying the RAM, and then they can acquire shelves of laptops. So laptops that have everything but the RAM and storage. And it's really interesting because in it, the host talks about how the reason he went into this industry was that he loved telling his family what laptop to get that you could upgrade. You could swap in and out better RAM or better storage when you're ready, so you didn't have to create as much computer waste. And now that's exactly what's impossible to do, to upgrade your RAM and storage, because that's more expensive than the actual entire laptop because of the squeeze on the market.
I'm really glad you mentioned this, actually, Kate, because I was in the UK maybe a month and a half ago now at this Government Digital Sustainability Alliance kind of conference. And one thing that people were discussing was the exact same thing in the public sector in the UK, actually. You had loads of people who were building, had circular electronics, right? And they were basically, people were telling me, there are people who work in some of these like circular electronics firms, or people who are buyers for this, and they're basically saying, I've had suppliers come to me saying, I know that I signed this contract to deliver these 10,000 laptops or 1,000 laptops, but I can't honor that anymore because the cost has gone so high that I can't do this at a rate that's viable, or they just don't have access to the figures. And for a lot of the time, it helped me realize that when you shift to this kind of agentic coding thing, right? Like on our machine, like when we're coding as developers, we're using a laptop, which has to rely on RAM and CPU. And most of the time we think about AI data center with a bunch of GPUs and stuff like that. But when you got agents using that, they have to use a bunch of RAM and a bunch of CPU that was in my laptop, right? So on one level, yeah, maybe there's this idea that if you centralize things, it becomes a bit easier to manage. But also, I'm definitely going to get outbid in a price war, me versus OpenAI, for example, right? And that's precisely what we're seeing happen. You had one company essentially corner, I think 40% of all the RAM was one of the figures, was one of this. I'll add a link to the show notes for this. But basically, when you're building a big data center that is now doing all this new agentic stuff, it has to use a computer too, and that's a massive new demand, a source of demand for CPUs and CPUs and RAM in a way that we hadn't really considered when we were just talking about the kind of 2023 era ChatGPT thing. This is actually a real thing that if you're looking for a mental model, I suppose it's a little bit like, do you remember in COVID when you had all these chip shortages? You had a whole thing where people would start buying washing machines for the chips because they had the same chips that were needed for cars, right? You had something like that. You cannibalized a bunch of washing machines to do something else. It looks like we've got a somewhat similar thing here, but just the spending power of the 2 or 3 large companies who are building all these data centers is just so large that it has all these second order effects, which really, really impact us. And that's pushing up the price of a bunch of the stuff that we have that isn't really easy to kind of capture in a lot of the kind of financial models people use right now, I suppose. So yeah, wow, I didn't realize this was happening in the US as well like this. This is, eye-opening.
Yeah, and it does speak to kind of the despair you can feel when you send in your old laptop to your company, knowing that it's just going to be scrapped for a couple parts, which is something I'm feeling right now. I just switched companies and I have to send in an old laptop, and I just know that it's not going to be used in its entirety. Probably it'll probably be taken for its part, and that's sad to know about all the material waste.
It would be nice if there was a way to get around this, right? I don't know what the solution for some of this might actually be, because you basically have one set of people who just have such massive pricing power that it just blows everyone else out the water. And the way what we're kind of prioritizing, it's very hard for us to kind of, it's very hard for like the needs of, say, some people who are of limited means when they're buying like a second hand or even a new machine, basically, compared to people who are like building things in data centers, because they just have just so much more, like they're able to like basically bring a degree of cash which is just beyond what most of us are able to do. I don't know what we're able to do for this, and it feels like you would need something which is like an outside the market kind of solution, because if you just follow like market principles, the people with the most money will just do this. And we've seen just how much money is being spent on the data center market right now. It's like in the hundreds of billions right now, and that's approaching what we spend in society. That's like approaching what we spend on clean energy, or even what we spend on fossil fuels. Like maybe if you're looking at like $600 or $700 billion of expenditure on data centers right now, and we spend maybe between $1 and $1.5 trillion globally on fossil fuels, and maybe $2 trillion on clean energy. It's not that far before it overtakes it, right? This is just mind blowing. We'll share the link to the Rystad report, because I think Ketan Yoshi, he shared a link to that a few days ago, and that just blew my mind that we've seen this new generational amount of investment that has all these other impacts that we're now having to deal with and navigate. And yeah, I don't know how to deal with it right now myself, actually. So I guess that's all I got for that, I'm afraid, Kate.
Yeah, and I think one thing we can do is continue to keep track of the downstream impacts. So here's one, and that we're sharing, and hopefully we can keep sharing out others so we can stay aware of what industries are kind of getting hit by some of these effects. So I think that covers all of our stories and topics for the day. I want to close up with just an announcement of a few upcoming events and trainings. So first up, we have Sustainable AI for Climate Tech Founders, April 22nd at 1 p.m. In San Francisco. And then another Sustainable AI event in Utrecht at 6 p.m. April 23rd, so the following day, but across the world. That'd be quite surprising if you're able to get to both. And then finally, we have a hot carbon workshop, and the call for papers just opened. So if you're working on carbon aware systems and sustainable computing research, definitely recommend taking a look at that workshop. That's at hotcarbon.org/CFP, and we'll have the links to all of these in the show notes. So that's it for this week's episode of The Week in Green Software. We covered SCI being a way to bridge the need to report your green software. We covered how SCI can bridge the need to fulfill your CSRD reporting requirements, how green prompting is more than just shorter prompts. We talked about open code and neural watt and the integration there, and about the laptop refurbished market being hit by the demand for RAM. So thanks for joining, and thank you, Chris, for always adding so much wealth of knowledge to these conversations. And a final reminder that a lot of resources, probably the last few weeks of reading, will be in the show notes for this episode, and that you can visit podcast.greensoftware.foundation to listen to more episodes of Environment Variables. And with that, we'll see you all next episode. So goodbye for now.
Thank you, Kate. See you, folks.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show. And of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.